Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another fabulous Friday Ramblings. I'm here, of course, the Ramblin' Bardic One, David Horton, because who else is going to ramble on Friday? We are here to help you start your weekend with a little bit of fun as we dive into the world of comic books in kind of a spin-off to one of our recent videos. Now, before we get too deep into this, I'm going to go ahead and give a small disclaimer. While I do generally try to keep my language a little all ages friendly, for the sake of various viewers and their personal ideas of what kind of language needs to be used, especially in an environment where we do go for a mostly positive vibe. As I always say, constructive criticism is where it's at. And I do try to keep the subject matter something that fits that theme. This particular subject matter, we really can't discuss it without discussing things of a adult and somewhat intimate nature. So here is your official disclaimer for this video. If you are really not the kind of person that wants to hear discussions of, as I said, adult, physically intimate concepts, especially ones that tend to be a little squinky. It's going to be kind of our key word today, squinky. Even by most people's standards. Although I am going to try to avoid using, more language than I really need to get the basic point across. That is going to be a recurring theme in part of this video, so feel free to not watch the video if you are not prepared to hear this kind of subject matter. And with that, we give our official disclaimer, so if you're still with us, thank you for staying with us, and I hope my disclaimer was clearly stated and understood so nobody gets offended by the base subject matter we're going to have to discuss in order to discuss these two particular characters. Now, as the title suggested, these characters are Gabriel and Sarah Stacy. Now, on the surface, that does not mean anything to most people. However, as I said, this is about comic books, specifically Spider-Man comic books. I know, we just discussed Spider-Man a few videos ago with our discussion of the Goblin Dynasty. And that's kind of the point. See, in there I had mentioned a Grey Goblin character. And I had said Grey Goblin was a person named Gabriel Stacy, and it's kind of complicated. Well, now we're going to uncomplicate it. Now, the character of Gabriel Stacy only showed up as a Grey Goblin. Blah, blah, blah. Get ahead of myself, and I get so used to saying Green Goblin. Not Green, Grey Goblin. Very briefly, but it is the backbone of the subject matter. And the story in general, especially the first of the three stories featuring Gabriel Stacy and his twin sister Sarah, are very infamous among Spider-Man fans. And these are stories, all three of them, definitely not stories that were written for little children. These stories were written at a time when Spider-Man books were definitely going for more of a older audience feel to them. Now, for a long time in Spider-Man's comic run history, he had multiple books being printed monthly. These days, not so much. For a little while there, we did have 2 books, but we are now down to 1 book starring Peter Parker. That is, of course, The Amazing Spider-Man, because that is the iconic title he has been with from almost the beginning. There are other books featuring extensions of Spider-Man family. Miles Morales, the Ultimate Spider-Man, has his own book. We have a book for Venom. We have a book for Venom's symbiote spinoff Scream. We have... I think the Black Cat book is still in publication. I would have to double check. We currently have a limited series run featuring Mary Jane Watson, Spider-Man's Lady Love, who will factor in a little bit to our discussions of the stories. But as of right now, Peter Parker only appears in one comic book as far as Spider-Man goes. He'll show up in some team books here and there, but it's all Amazing Spider-Man. However, at the time of these particular storylines, Spider-Man had multiple titles running, and each title had its own separate writer. Now, what this means is that in any given month, you would have a few slightly different views of Peter Parker, just depending on the writers and their different flavors. So, with that all being said, let's break down Gabriel and Sarah Stacy and why they are some of the most infamous characters in Spider-Man lore, and especially in recent decades, some of the least liked, and whether or not they and the stories deserve it. First up, we are going to start with the very popular, very excellent writer, J. Michael Straczynski. Now, J. Michael Straczynski is a writer who has worked in pretty much every medium there is. He has written comic books, he has written books, he has written... Yes, I know I said books, that sounds hilariously redundant. He's written for television, he's all over the place. He's a tremendously creative writer. And he has done a lot of work for Marvel on a few different characters, including a nice extended run on Spider-Man. So, partway through his run on Spider-Man, specifically the Amazing Spider-Man 509 through 514, from August 2004 to January 2005, he wrote a story called Sins Past. Now, Sins Past revealed that, as its thing kind of says, the past, way back in the past, Spider-Man's biggest rival, Norman Osborn, had a brief sexual affair with Spider-Man's then-girlfriend, Gwen Stacy. And as I said, here's where things get squinky. Not only was there a distinct age difference between them, as Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker are the same age as Norman's son, Harry, and in fact that is the backdrop of them, as this occurred during the point in time where Harry, as a college student, was suffering from drug addiction. Specifically, he was going through some serious overdosing problems and was in danger of dying from this. This was one of those storylines they did in, the 70s, where a lot of comic books were discussing, the real dangers of drug use, because it was becoming so very rampant in American society. A lot of movies and TV were doing it too. We're certainly not picking on comic books or trying to unnecessarily praise them, depending on how you take the idea of having very real depictions of drug use present in comics. It was just very culture of the time. What was not very cultural of the time was having a woman in an emotionally weird state who herself was, to kind of steal a pop culture term, borderline barely legal, have herself a fling with one of her best friend's fathers. I know, I'm sorry folks, there really is no way to say this without it sounding weird and creepy, and that's the major component people have with this storyline, is the whole thing is based on a retcon that at least once, possibly a couple other times, again, I have to say it, a woman in her early 20s slept with her best friend's father. despite the fact that normally she doesn't really like him. Now, I give J. Michael Straczynski all the credit in the world. He tried to play this up as, you know, a situation where Norman's inherent, you know, powerful personality and just charismatic aura mixed with his emotionally confused state at the time, seeing his son, you know, suffering horribly from drug overdose, not wanting to take him to the hospital because of the scandal it would cause, because, you know, the Osbournes were one of the great business families in New York. You don't take the heir apparent to the Osbourne company, have him show up in the hospital with a bunch of illegal narcotics in his system, and people not start talking about it. And Gwen just being young and kind of inexperienced, especially with, hey, I don't know why I feel like I should be trying to comfort this man in this particular way. And when he's kind of responding to it as well, it's just, thankfully, it's only shown on a couple of panels, and it's more about the narration box. Nothing explicit is drawn, but it is there. And because of that, very physical encounters, Gwen herself becomes pregnant and temporarily goes to France to sort everything out. Now, that basic idea, that there was a period of time where Gwen did flee New York to sort out confused feelings she had, did occur in Spider-Man history. What J. Michael Straczynski is doing is adding extra layers as to why she was in such a state where she had to completely separate herself from her life to make sense of her life. Now, again, full credit to Mr. Straczynski, and I do hope I'm pronouncing his name right. That's how I've heard it said before, many years ago, so that's the pronunciation I'm going with. But full credit to him, his initial pitch of the script was that they were Peter Parker's kids. Because again, Peter and Gwen were involved with each other at the time, and they were actually the same age. I mean, I'm not a huge person with, like, you know, oh, people have to be within a couple ages of each other to be involved. But, you know, when it's literally a generation apart, that's when it starts being like, okay, I can kind of see why you're making folks uncomfortable. But anyway, coming back around, that was his initial pitch. And that due to Peter's altered DNA from the fact he's Spider-Man, you know, radioactive spider bite, spider DNA, doing all the things that a spider can, that this would cause the children to age at a rapid rate. So even though it had only been a few years since Gwen had died, they would appear to be physical adults. This being a highly fictionalized sci-fi variant of real-life medical disorders such as Progeria, where the body physically ages much faster than it should. However, writers in the editorial felt that by having Peter Parker have children, it would age the character too much in a psychological sense for the readers. Now, the same argument was used a few years later by certain editors for the reason of the Brand New Day soft reboot of continuity, where they said Spider-Man had never been married to Mary Jane. They had just lived together as a couple for a while and eventually broke up. Because apparently him being divorced would psychologically age him to readers. I've never understood that logic. And again, when you're blatantly stating the character's aged at like, and again, I don't know the hard math, but basically like 8 times faster than they should. No, it doesn't age the other characters involved. But that's editorial. That's personal perspective. It's just something you have to deal with. So the decision was made that they would be Norman's children, and thus Norman and Gwen got it on. So again, full credit J. Michael Straczynski. The original story he wanted to write, no, there was no Norman Gwen super awkward, squinky thing going on. So, fast forward to the present. The twins, as adults, raised by Norman in Europe, with Norman claiming that Peter Parker was in fact their father, and it was his blatantly conscious decision to kill Gwen Stacy. Very much not true. So that he could train them to be vengeance-seeking, angry people who would eventually go after Spider-Man / Peter Parker. And they do. And they manage to hurt him. Eventually, he figures out who they are, and he hits major emotional turmoil because this is, again, it changes his whole view of his deceased former girlfriend, Gwen. And it doesn't help that Sarah looks a hell of a lot like her mother, and thus is the age, due to that rapid aging thing, that Gwen was when she died. So Peter's got all kinds of crazy thoughts in his head. He wants to preserve Gwen's legacy, but now he's questioning what Gwen's legacy is because she slept with Norman, and Norman's a horrible person. The revelation that his wife, Mary Jane, knew about this because Mary Jane was a friend of Gwen and Peter at the time, and Gwen had confided in MJ that she had hidden this from Peter all these years because, A, she thought the children had died over there in Europe when Gwen came back without them, and B, Gwen had told her, don't tell Peter, I will, but unfortunately Gwen herself died before she could tell Peter, so it all becomes a thing. It's a very emotional story, and honestly, I am going to say, mostly because of the incredibly great writing of the talented Mr. Straczynski here. The whole thing, if you can get past that idea of who the father and mother of Gabriel and Sarah Stacy are, and that image of... if you can get past that and just focus on the story of the present, it is an incredibly well done story. It puts Peter Parker through psychological turmoil, which, while that is Spider-Man's bread and butter, is putting a new spin on that psychological turmoil by having him have to reevaluate his memories of a deceased love, as well as him questioning, can he really look at these two as just straight up criminals, or can he rehabilitate them, and should he rehabilitate them in part to preserve the most positive aspects of Gwen Stacy and her memories for all her friends. And in the end, that is the decision he makes. He gives an injured Sarah Stacy a blood transfusion, and his altered spider DNA mixes with her messed up goblin formula inherited DNA, stabilizes her rapid aging condition. Her brother Gabriel, refusing to forgive Spider-Man, even if he was not in fact the one that killed Gwen Stacy, let alone did it consciously, because, you know, Norman told him Spider-Man was a huge jerk, which he wasn't, because Norman's the huge jerk, resulted in Gabriel finding one of Norman's old safe houses and embracing his goblin heritage, becoming the Grey Goblin briefly, before Sarah and Peter team up to take him out. We last see Gabriel washing up on a nearby beach, seemingly amnesiac. Now, by and large, for a story that wasn't critically acclaimed or received well by the fan base, you'd think that would have been it. The fans didn't embrace the characters. A lot of them were just weirded out by the opening acts and the origins. But the beauty thing about comics, and especially when you have multiple writers working on one character's mythos, is somebody else can always give them a try. And that leads us to the second story in this trilogy. That is Sins Remembered. See how we go? Sins Past, Sins Remembered. Now, Sins Remembered was not written by J. Michael Straczynski as part of The Amazing Spider-Man. It was actually published in the Spectacular Spider-Man issues 23 through 26 in December 2004 through March of 2005, which makes it several months later. So a pretty quick sequel. Now this was written by Sam Barnes because he was the writer of Spectacular Spider-Man at the time. Now, in Sins Remembered, Sarah Stacy contacts Peter from Paris and asks him to help her out with some problems. He goes because he still feels responsibility for her, and thus we have a little bit of personal conflict as Mary Jane feels a little weird that Peter is so adamant about rushing to the aid of somebody who, again, is pretty much a carbon copy in physical appearance-wise for Gwen Stacy, the only other woman he would have considered marrying besides Mary Jane. But more importantly than that is the fact that upon arriving in Paris, Sarah not only seems to be keeping a couple secrets from Spider-Man, but the help she needs involves her past, specifically the short period upon her and Gabriel reaching adulthood, but before they journeyed to New York to seek their revenge, where they got involved with a local criminal gang, specifically a local drug lord, as they had found some of the drugs he had actually alleviated some of the symptoms of their rapid aging and altered DNA. So he kind of gets involved in this, encouraging Sarah Stacy not to be too violent in her methods of getting her and Gabriel's debts to this drug lord repaid and forgiven, but at the same time also, not really being that thrilled with the idea that she, even behind Norman's back, his influence as raising her had still been so deeply embedded that she was choosing to consort with criminals. But, she was young. The real fun in all this, and getting back to some of that squinkiness, is that Sarah, while she does physically look the same age as Peter, plus or minus a couple years, mentally is basically a young teenager, and partly because she didn't want to tell Spider-Man everything about this whole drug lord debt thing, runs him around Paris, showing him the sights, and does some kind of sort of flirting with him, including encouraging him not to worry about booking a hotel, but to stay in the guest room of the manor where her and her brother grew up and she still lives. Now, yes, separate bedrooms, but still. There were a few moments in the storyline. It was not quite as bad as the whole Gabriel-Gwen thing, but it is still... There was definitely a subplot of... Does she want me to? Should I? I really shouldn't. I am married, but she really wants me to. And God, she looks a lot like my ex-girlfriend who... I really shouldn't. But how do I tell her if she really comes on? It's... As I said, it's squinky. It's not quite as hardcore squinky as the first one, but there is still that taint. Something about these characters that just are just sexually dysfunctional. But as I said, fortunately he's played up a little more comedically in this one. And when it's all said and done, we find out that besides the whole drug lord debt thing, specifically Sarah Stacy has also, in that intervening period since we last saw her in Sins Past, located the amnesiac Gabriel Stacy and is hiding him in the manor from Peter, which is all well and good until MJ tracks them down and, while wandering the house looking for them while they are out dealing with drug lord Boyo, stumbles upon Gabriel, who in his mentally addled state thinks MJ is Sarah and tries to forcibly take her with him to escape the police that are raiding his house. When it's all said and done, Gabriel ends up escaping alone. Sarah is offered a job by Interpol, who had been investigating the drug lord as well, who promised to use their resources to find some medication to help her with the lingering symptoms of her rapid aging so that she can live a normal, healthy life from here. Now, this ends Sarah Stacy's tale. Gabriel would show up one more time in a mini-series by writer Brian Reed. Now, this mini-series is more of a loose trilogy in that it is more of a direct sequel to a storyline where a different storyline focusing on Harry called American Son. That was part of the monthly Amazing Spider-Man series, where Norman Osborn, during the period where he was in a position of power within the government and in charge of the registered federally government registered superhero community. Probably a better way to phrase that, but oh well. That's how I did it. Commissioned a set of high-tech armor for Harry to be once again his heir apparent as American Son. A playoff on Norman's new goblin-free identity of the Iron Patriot. Harry would refuse the offer. Norman would shortly thereafter fall from power, go back to prison. However, while trying to live his quiet little life by himself, Harry would be confronted by Gabriel and shot. Harry would survive, but he was addled by the revelation of his half-brother, both being here and wanting to seek revenge on Harry because Gabriel felt that Harry was always the preferred son. At the same time, we see a mysterious being show up in the American Son armor, committing acts of good. Now, this 4-issue miniseries featuring this Harry-Gabriel confrontation was written by Brian Reed. Again, third writer tackling these characters and attempting to do what he can with them. Brian Reed took the angle that after recovering from his amnesia, Gabriel Stacy had suffered a split personality, wherein as Gabriel Stacy, he would be selfish, petty, criminalistic, but then would don the American Son armor and take on a different personality in which he felt that he needed to commit acts of good to make up for what the Gabriel personality was doing. Unfortunately, the Gabriel personality takes dominance and once again attempts to kill Harry. Harry's response is to fight back because in Gabriel he sees his father and his father's legacy that Harry had been trying to separate himself from for quite some time. The final battle, Gabriel takes control of the American Son armor without reverting to his heroic personality. However, Harry trips him up by pointing out since the American Son armor was devised for Harry, and Gabriel is not the genius his father was, Harry's still logged in as part of the voice-activated control system, hacks the armor, forces it to disassemble and deactivate, and takes advantage of Gabriel's stunned shock to knock him out. Gabriel then returns to prison, where he is informed that the American Son armor has been completely disassembled and destroyed. However, almost immediately thereafter, he is given a package in the mail system where he sees the American Son helmet, along with a note from Norman proclaiming that he is proud of Gabriel. Now, this plot point has not been followed up on since then. We have not seen Gabriel or Sarah Stacy in over 10 years. Will they ever return? I don't know. I will say this. Out of the 3 stories, American Son is the best of them because, one, it doesn't involve any sexual squinkiness. Now, personally, it doesn't bother me. I'm the kind of person that, on the surface, it's like, yeah, the first time you kind of, read this stuff, especially if you are a longtime Spider-Man reader, it does kind of catch you, and you're like, bleh, bleh. Honestly, just the idea of Norman having sex with anybody is kind of bleh. But it is what it is. Anyway, I was able to kind of get past those scenes and continue reading the story and enjoy the rest of the story for what it is. And all 3 stories are good Spider-Man stories. They're not great Spider-Man stories. They're not all-time iconic Spider-Man stories. But they each do serve a purpose. And they each do get better. You could see where, as the different writers took the different characters, moved them past the origins. As I said, American Son doesn't even involve Sarah Stacy. It focuses specifically on Gabriel and his place as a potential replacement for Harry at a time where Harry, frankly, didn't want to touch his last name, Osborn, or have anything to do with his father. And manipulative Norman, obviously not being happy to hear that. You do get a story where it is about Harry without donning the Green Goblin suit, proving that Harry, just as Harry, not as a superhero, not as a supervillain, just Harry as a man, stepping up and asserting his independence from his father, from his father's shadow, and making a point that he is not going to be victimized by anybody. So with all that wrapped up, here's the big question. Should you read these stories? If you really dig Spider-Man and you really want to get a sense of, how Spider-Man does react to going through the kind of emotional stuff that would break most of us, yes, by all means. On that level of Peter being dragged through the ringer mentally, Sins Past and Sins Remembered are great stories. If you really want to get a feel for the Harry-Norman relationship in modern times, yes, read the American Son miniseries. Actually, go ahead and track down the original American Son story that was a story arc in the monthly, and read the American Son miniseries, because even though Gabriel's only in the miniseries part, the original series is a good story on its own that helps set the backdrop for the American Son mini. So, it's a thing. Now, for the casual Marvel reader, are they necessary stories? No. Not at all. They're for the Spider-Man mythos fan base. As I said, we'll probably never see Gabriel and Sarah Stacy again. Unless somebody comes up who just really has a bang-up storyline idea, who just, really has an idea that they feel super confident about, and they do a great job of pitching it to Marvel. Anything's possible. Neither one of the characters was said to be dead. And in comic books, death doesn't really matter. Death can always be undone. But, frankly, I'm not, anticipating it anytime soon. So there you go. I'm not going to give them a hard recommend, but I'm not going to completely say never ever touch these stories either. All three stories in the Gabriel and Sarah Stacy saga are well written for what they are. But Sins Past, especially, and a little bit on the surface of Sins Remembered, as I said with my disclaimer, if you're not really the kind of person that's comfortable reading about certain kinds of sexual situations and implications, especially in your superheroes and supervillains, you're not going to enjoy these stories. You'll pretty much be safe with American Son. Both parts of it. But the two Sins stories, probably not going to get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So, they're not horrible stories. They're not nowhere near the worst stories ever written in Spider-Man history. They're right in the middle. And frankly, if somebody said that about any Spider-Man story I ever got to write for Marvel, that, hey, this is nowhere near the worst Spider-Man story I've ever read. Frankly, there is a good gem buried underneath some of this dirt here. It's a solid C+. I'd be happy to hear that. I mean, there's a ton of Spider-Man material. There's a lot of really great iconic stories. So if I got even, a step below them, I'd get 2 steps below them, I'd be happy. As long as I'm not way down here at the basement. If people are like, hey, there's a lot of good stuff in this story, you can put yourself in the right mindset before reading them and kind of get prepared for the parts that are kind of, do we have to? Yeah, they're good stories worth reading. I'd love to hear that as a writer. Especially if I was somebody that had to follow up an earlier story done by that. It's one thing to be the guy that starts it. It's another to try to elevate it and redeem it. So with that, we are done till next Friday. And I do hope you join us. I don't know what I'm going to talk about yet in 7 days. But hopefully it won't need a disclaimer. And hey, at least we got through this subject without any profanity. Because, that's what I do for you people. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay tuned in. Because Roulette Productions rolls on. Let's start counting down till next episode. 7 days.